So I just want to follow up on my last video where I talked about Jordan Peterson's conservative feminism. And, maybe I want to elaborate on some of those points and bring up a few others. And the first thing I want to say is maybe I wasn't giving the guy enough credit. I've seen some videos since then where he's significantly more based than normal. So I do think it is the case that he thinks a lot more than he generally says. And I understand that. I mean, he's in a tight spot. He's in Canada, of all places. So there's a lot of stuff he just isn't able to say, at least not without severe consequences, possibly even legal consequences. And there are even things that he's required to say, which I know he finds reprehensible. So I get that. I understand that. You want to speak the truth. You want to speak nothing but the truth, but the whole truth is a damn tall order. And I'm not sure it's one that any of us can live up to or should live up to at all times. But, my main complaint with Peterson actually has less to do with this feminism stuff and more to do with his constant attacks on group identity from an individualist, classical liberal perspective. And I kind of touched on that a little bit in my last video, but I didn't really go into it. But, my problem with this is because group identity can be explained in terms of individual incentives. And it can be defended in terms of individual incentives. So, individualism does not invalidate group identity. Group identity is part of a whole healthy individual. And that's something I don't think he goes into in enough depth or gives enough credit. I mentioned that he regards the fundamental or the most important aspect of society to be the extent to which it protects individual rights and individual freedoms. But, maybe there are some things that are more fundamental than this, that are more important to this. You can't have any rights and freedoms if you don't survive. All right? And your society can't safeguard any rights and freedoms. Your culture, your nation, whatever you want to call it, whatever level of detail you're looking at, can't protect any rights and freedoms for you if it doesn't survive in conflict and competition with others. So maybe those things are more important than your individual freedom and your individual rights. And furthermore, societies are kind of like an emergent phenotype. They're an extended phenotype, an emergent property of the attitudes and behaviors and actions of individuals. And those vary, but they don't vary randomly. They vary in systematic and predictable ways. And a lot of those individual qualities, those individual characteristics, are extremely heritable. And the distributions of those characteristics differ from population to population. So you can't just abstract your social system or your culture or your society or your nation. You can't just abstract that away from a particular group of people. You can't do that. They're fundamentally intertwined. Now, I talked about voting and some of the problems with letting women vote, but maybe we should back up and point out that democracy is kind of fundamentally flawed from the get-go. And this is because of a couple of different problems. I'll go into a few of them. One of them is the problem of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. And simply put, if there's a small number of people realizing a huge benefit from some particular policy, and there's a large number of people bearing a smaller dispersed cost, a smaller individual cost, but spread over a larger number of people, then the total cost can be much greater than the total benefit to those few people that are realizing a large individual benefit. And those few people will be more willing and able to organize and to fight to protect that benefit than the people bearing the cost will be organized to oppose it. And this is for a couple of reasons. It's simply easier to organize a small group. Also, if the members of that small group have more on the line individually, they're going to be more motivated. They're going to be more focused. They're going to prioritize that issue more than, somebody who has a bunch of small issues on their plate. They're not going to prioritize those issues, those small issues, over something that's important to them. So that's the problem of concentrated benefits and disperse costs, and it makes democracy kind of irreparably prone to special interest corruption. So that's a problem. There's also conflicts of interest. Voting works great for deciding on priorities between people with common interests. That's why it works so great for a corporation, because shareholders' interests are aligned towards maximization of profit. And maybe not completely, you can also have shareholders that are customers or shareholders that are employees, and then there might be a little bit of conflict of interest there. But in general, the interests of shareholders are perfectly aligned towards maximization of profit. So there's no way for one shareholder to profit at the expense of another. And so voting works just great for selecting priorities because they have common interests. But where interests genuinely conflict, voting cannot work that out. Voting cannot settle that conflict. It can only determine whose interests are to prevail over who else's. So that's another problem with democracy. Introducing women into the mix makes this exponentially worse because, as I mentioned before, women don't fight. All right, so they change the outcomes of elections, but they don't change the outcomes of likely combat because they don't participate on a large scale in organized fighting. Now, this messes with incentives because if we hold a vote as a proxy for violence or as an alternative to violence, I may be willing to submit to an electoral defeat even at the cost of having my interests subordinated to some other people's. If it's going to be less costly to submit than to fight, and if the outcome of an election and the outcome of a fight are more or less the same. All right? But now you throw women into the mix, people who vote, and they vote differently from men, systematically differently, but they don't fight. So they sway the election one way, but they wouldn't sway the fight the other way. Well, that fundamentally changes the incentives. That makes it more costly to submit and more beneficial not to submit, not to go along with it, but to fight it. Because maybe I lose the election, but we might win the war. So, in my opinion, giving women the vote makes democracies unstable and probably inevitably doomed to descend back into violence. Now, I mentioned a lot of the problems with women working. And on top of this, you could add that giving women more career opportunities, more ways to seek, obtain, and signal status, besides motherhood and family, means you'll get less motherhood and family. Right? Because if you give them alternatives, they'll do that less. And that's exactly what we're seeing. There was an article in the New York Times recently that said millennial women will have the largest gap between desired fertility and actual fertility. They want 2.7 children, which would be great. They're going to get 1.8. That's almost a full child gap. And, I would suggest that maybe helping women to address that gap, to achieve their own reproductive ambitions, is maybe a more fruitful thing to help them out with than, career goals or something that's just going to distract them from that. So now the other problem with this is it's going to produce a dysgenic tendency. The reproduction that is done is going to be done disproportionately by the women with the fewest and the least best other alternatives for what to do with themselves. All right, and the women who do have the most and the best opportunities, who we might broadly characterize as the best women, are going to do the least reproduction. And there's a negative correlation between educational achievement and career success and total completed fertility for women, but not for men, which is one reason why it makes sense for men to specialize in economic production and women to specialize in reproduction and family and domestic tasks. And that ultimately has to do with the difference in biological cost and investment for reproduction between men and women. For a woman, reproduction just takes her a lot more away from her career than it does for a man. And a career takes her a lot more away from reproduction by the same token. So you get demographic decline, but you also get dysgenia. Your population gets smaller as it gets worse. And that's not good. Now, Peterson talks about duty and obligation, how we've talked to men too much about their rights and their freedoms, and not enough about their duties and obligations. But if that's true for men, it must be true for women as well. And these duties and obligations must include things like getting married, staying married, because that's what's best for children, stable homes with their biological parents. Incontrovertible, absolutely incontrovertible there. Having children, because if they don't have children, society doesn't continue on. Not for more than a generation or two, not in the same form or even a similar form. So if they're not doing those things, they're just, squandering or burning their individual genetic inheritance on a single lifetime of careerism or slutting it up or whatever the hell they think is more important than propagating the members of the society to which they belong, the people who created and can maintain that society to which they belong and which creates everything that they enjoy. So those are profoundly necessary duties. And in a society where they're not normative, that society is not going to last. It just isn't. So if the situation is so dire, why not revolt against this? Well, maybe if you're climbing the sum of all dominance hierarchies, you're progressing from impecunious youth to mature, established man of means, it's not worth revolting. There's still light at the end of the tunnel. There's still a good life to be made, a decent life to be made, even if the slope of that rise may be shallower than it was for past generations, and every gain is more difficult. Maybe it's not worth revolting. And I think that was probably the case for our fathers and grandfathers. The changes already might have been somewhat imperceptible. Or maybe once they became perceptible, they were still not intolerable. All right, but for our generation and younger, it's going to become increasingly difficult and increasingly improbable to make that climb up the sum of all dominance hierarchies. And increasingly difficult and increasingly costly. It's not impossible. I'm not saying it's impossible. You can still make that climb, but it's much, much harder than it ever has been before. And, I'm not going to go out and revolt tomorrow, and neither should you. But if things keep going like they have been going, there will come a time when there is no other option or no better option than that. There was an incident with the Spartans where they were defeated in battle and their enemies demanded 200 Spartan youth as hostages. And they said, look, we can't give you the youth because then we won't be able to educate them in our ways. But we'll give you 200 Spartan men. And the enemies insisted, nevertheless, on the youth. And the Spartans, taking up their arms again, said, if you lay terms on us that are graver than death, we would sooner prefer to die. And, if you don't think that there are terms worse than death, you just haven't thought about it too much. Because there are those kind of terms, and there's a lot of people who want to make those kind of demands or want to impose those kind of terms. And, that's where we're going to be probably sooner rather than later. Now, I do want to say also that I know I'm going to get flack in the comments for going too easy on Peterson. And, I don't really care about that because, I disagree with Peterson about some things. I agree with Peterson about some things. I hope that he's a man of good faith and goodwill and that he can take this criticism for what it is. But he's also a powerful man and an influential man, and I don't think it's helpful to make him an enemy if you don't have to. I think it's definitely worthwhile to criticize anybody when they're wrong, but give them credit when they aren't.